part. Welcome, everyone. This is a joint meeting on Standing Committee on Government Operations and Standing Committee on Social Development. Before we go forward, I'll ask Ms. Green to open up with a prayer.
We gather together here today intent on doing good work. We seek to represent fairly and well those who have given us this task. May our efforts be blessed with insight, guided by understanding and wisdom. We seek to serve with respect for all. May our personal faiths give us strength to act honestly and well in all matters before us. Amen.
I'd like to welcome to this meeting on the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Standing Committee on Social Development. At this point in time, I'll ask committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Blake.
Good morning, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta.
Morning, Tom Bowie, MLA for Tuneda-Willowday.
Mr. Simpson? Oh, no, sorry. Danny?
Danny McNeely, Satu Region. Good morning.
Good morning, Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning and welcome, RJ Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
Good morning, Kieran Tester, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations.
Good morning as well, Shane Thompson, the Henday. On my left is Alyssa Holland, our law clerk. On my left there, over in the corner, is April Taylor and Megan Welsh, both are research analysts. And on my right is Sarah Kay and Jennifer Franki-Smith, both clerks of our committees. Today, the Standing Committee of Government Operations and Social Development are holding a public clause-by-clause review of Bill 6, the Cannabis Legislation and Regulation Implementation Act. Bill 6 was referred to committee on March 1st, 2018. Since then, committees have completed extensive public consultation meetings in 16 communities across the NWT. The Act proposes two new laws for cannabis control, the Cannabis Product Act and the Cannabis Smoking Control Act. It is also proposes amendment to the current law on impaired driving found in the Territorial Motor Vehicle Act to address drug-impaired driving. The bill itself is available at the back of the room along with briefing notes. I would like to invite the Honourable Lou Sebert, Minister of Justice, to introduce his staff for the record and proceed with any opening comments you may have. Minister Sebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are pleased to be here today to talk to you about Bill 6, the Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Act. Joining us today are officials from the Departments of Finance, Justice, Infrastructure, and Health and Social Services to assist in answering your questions. They are Sandy Kalgutkar, Deputy Secretary to the FMB, Mark Aitken, Assistant Deputy Minister, and Mike Reddy, Director, Legislation Division, both with Justice. Megan Birch, Manager, Legislative Affairs with Infrastructure, and Gary Toft, Director, Policy, Legislation, and Communications with Health and Social Services. I'm also joined by my Ministerial Special Advisor, Stephen Dunbar, Emily Ingerfield, Manager of Policy with the Department of Justice, and Raven Bedingfield, Senior Policy Advisor with Health and Social Services. The development of Bill 6 required significant interdepartmental collaboration and has benefited from feedback from the public, Indigenous governments, community governments, and other stakeholders received during an extensive engagement process that occurred during the summer and fall of 2017. Since that time, the Joint Standing Committee has conducted further engagement with residents, and we look forward to hearing about that today. We recognize that not everyone agrees with all aspects of the legislation being proposed, but as a government, we have an obligation to make the best decisions we can to design a system that puts the health and safety of our residents first and that follows the guiding principles that received overwhelming support during the engagement. In addition to the feedback received from our cannabis engagement process, other important factors were considered when determining our approach included discussion and information from other jurisdictions, discussion with enforcement partners, practical and financial implications for implementation of in the required time frame, current research on the health impacts of cannabis. We would like to acknowledge the collaboration amongst departments to bring forward the legislation under the challenging timelines, and also the willingness of the committees to work together to review this bill and to ensure we are in a position to respond effectively to the federal legislation. We would be pleased to answer any questions that the committee may have regarding Bill 6. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Does committee have any general comments or questions for the minister at this time? Seeing none. If there's no, so does committee agree to proceed to a clause-by-clause review, Bill 6, Cannabis Legislation and Regulation Impact Act? Agreed? Before we go clause by clause, I must apologize. We do have another minister present, and I forgot to recognize R.C. McLeod. Do you wish to have any comments? You're good? Okay, I apologize on behalf. Committee agreed to conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 6. There are 3 schedules, A, B, and C, in the bill. We will go through each of the schedules individually before returning to the clause of Bill 6, which are found on page 1 of the bill. Let's turn to Schedule A, Clause 1, which is on page 8. There are 72 clauses in Schedule A. Does the committee agree to group some of the clauses as schedules as we proceed with this review?
Agreed.
Agreed? Clause 1. Sorry. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subsection 1, brackets 1 of Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following definition in alphabetical order. Quotations, consume means to ingest cannabis orally or by any other means, including smoking by means of an e-cigarette or a vaporizer.
Do we have a mover, seconder? By that, Mr. McNeely. Motion's in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Clause 1. Agreed?
Clause 1 is amended.
Yeah. As amended, sorry.
I think there's another definition of things changing in this area. Public place.
The next section of the bill.
It's still in section, Schedule A, section 1, subsection.
Mr. Simpson, sorry, correct. This is the clause that Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. So just to be clear, committee has agreed to the previous clause? Is that
Yes.
what just happened? Okay.
Okay.
I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by deleting the definition public place in subsection 1.1.
Seconded by? Ms. Green? Okay, the motion's in order to the motion. Question's been called? All in favor? Opposed? Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Okay. Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause was as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Clause 2.
Agreed.
Clause 3.
Agreed.
Clause 4.
Agreed.
Clause 5. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Will I read out the motion?
Yes, please.
I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following after subsection 5 brackets 1.1 before the minister designates a person to act as a vendor under subsection 1. The minister shall ensure that the person meets the prescribed criteria. 1.2, if a person meets the prescribed criteria, the minister shall designate that person to act as a vendor unless the minister provides a reasonable justification for not doing so. And 1.3, the minister shall not require that in order for a person to be designated as a vendor under subsection 1, the person must also be designated as a vendor under subsection 34(1) of the Liquor Act.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Seconder?
Yes.
Mr. Tester? The motion is in order. To the motion?
Question?
Question? Nope. Mr. Okay. Ms. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, during our consultation period, we heard from communities, large and small, that they wanted to have the opportunity to have cannabis stores and to have those as separate from liquor stores in their communities. The small communities had the perception that if they had cannabis stores of their own, they would have the revenue that it generates, and they could spend it on their own community priorities, including wellness. In Yellowknife, there was a similar sentiment, not so much that the money would be put aside for wellness, but that there be a vendorship opportunity given to the private sector, and that it not be automatically assigned to the Liquor Commission, which is what the minister has in mind now. This motion opens up vendorship. It doesn't force the minister's hand in any way. The timing can still be flexible about when communities decide they're ready for vendorship. And of course, they have the opportunity to clarify their community position with a plebiscite in advance of any change. So for that reason, I'm forwarding this amendment to the motion. I'm finding it very distracting at the front. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Tester?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to second this motion. This is one of the most significant areas of the bill that that members of the public were concerned about, and that was not restricted only to what we might refer to as market communities. And we did see these concerns around more or less a privatized retail system echoed across the territories, not restricted to larger centers. And this is a very flexible amendment. It is very clear that should this carry, the Liquor Commission will not be the only agency for providing retail cannabis in the Northwest Territories. And it does give the minister the flexibility to set criteria for who should be a vendor, and that's consistent with other privatized systems such as in Alberta. I believe that this motion will allow us to better expand on not only economic opportunities, but on the supply of cannabis as it's made available to Northerners. And that's a crucial factor that the committee considered as well. We heard loud and clear that bootlegging and the illicit trade of drugs is a major concern, especially in the small communities. And by expanding on the number of retail outlets for cannabis, we will allow a greater access to supply, and further competition may actually result in a lower price point, which would allow for further disruption of the illicit trade of cannabis in the Northwest Territories. So although there's still work to be done on the part of the government to bring forward regulations to determine the criteria, I fully support the motion from my colleague, and I'm very pleased to second it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. Riley?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was part of the northern group that went to a number of communities, and I don't think I heard that there was universal support for cannabis stores in all the small communities, but there were certainly individuals that expressed an interest in this, and the organized business community in Yellowknife through the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, the NWT Chamber of Commerce, did express an interest in allowing for cannabis stores outside of the liquor retail system, and I think that's what this motion allows. And I understand that this is a different approach than what has been originally proposed by our cabinet colleagues. But what this does is allow the minister to set out a number of prescribed criteria, which of course would happen in regulation. So there is an onus on the minister and cabinet to get together those criteria, and once they are developed, minister can still refuse an application, but it has to be based on reasonable justification for doing so. This doesn't prevent sale through liquor stores. We may come to another amendment that deals with that matter, but and the Liquor Commission will still continue as the wholesaler. But what this does do is allow for private retailers. I know even our cabinet colleagues had talked about maybe after 2 years allowing for that. This would open this up sooner, and that's what this is really about. I expect that in the criteria that the minister would develop, there would be a number of things, possibly setting out training, qualifications of owners or potential vendors and so on. So it does create an onus on our cabinet colleagues to set those out perhaps more quickly than they would have liked, but I do support this, and I don't think there's going to be support from everybody, but it's something that reflects what we heard in some of the small communities as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not common, or perhaps it's not common, that you get support for something like this from all the small communities we visited, the regional centers, from the NWT Chamber of Commerce, from the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, but this is what I heard in every single community we visited, well, maybe with the exception of one. In small communities, we heard that people want to be able to control what's in the community, and if they have a cannabis retailer there, they know what's in the communities. It also would allow for cannabis to be, a safe supply of cannabis to be sold legally in communities, instead of just allowing drug dealers to remain in those communities, which is what's happening now. And I think that if you look at a harm reduction perspective, the liquor stores, being only in regional centers, has done nothing really to mitigate the harm that's caused by alcohol in the communities. And so I think people desire a different approach. In the small communities, they also see the opportunity for local cannabis stores as an employment opportunity. You know, in these places where there's virtually no jobs, people are clamoring for something like this. And I think this issue, as well as education about cannabis, were the two major concerns I heard in every single community we've gone to. And I think that if more consultation was done prior to drafting this bill, this would have been in there, because there's no way that this would have gone unheard if the department had gone around to more centers. And so I'll be supporting this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we toured the northern section of the territory, majority of the communities that we visited weren't in favor of this. I know it is the early stages of legalization, but the communities I felt were kind of leery of, the availability, especially to minors. So with that, I won't be able to support this motion. Two of the communities that we visited were in my riding, so I have to respect those communities, and I won't be able to support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, of course, I traveled with a group from the south, and what Mr. Simpson had indicated was pretty clear to me. But one of the main reasons I would support this is because if we don't do anything, then there's just no way that the people from the remote communities can afford to travel to the regional center to buy cannabis legally. So I think that by not being present in small communities, by not having a legal entity in a community selling cannabis, then you will continue to feed the illegal drug trade. And I think that when this whole bill came in, one of the main reasons that I would support it was because it was eliminating a lot of unnecessary policing, and a lot of, it's been a tremendous cost to the system in order to govern something that, for all experts tell us, it has been fairly harmless to our environment. And now we're going to set up a system where only certain places can be allowed to sell cannabis, and then in the small communities, the individuals that wish to consume cannabis will be going through the illegal process of obtaining marijuana, unless we do something like this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Mr. McNeil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To this amendment here, I was really surprised in our community consultation visits and as well as my private visits here, to what extent is being cannabis consumed by the general public. It was very surprising to me what we heard in all the communities, including the high school students that we went to visit. And some private consultations that I had on my own outside of our group sessions allowed me to talk freely with the individuals. And surprisingly, there were some reputable citizens of our communities that I heard from saying pretty much the same thing. It's here already. We need control of this substance. And another fact to really open my eyes is to say the current situation now allows the buyer to buy it off the street from whoever. Having it regulated allows the buyer to buy, call it premium, clean quality cannabis. So you don't have the assumption that, okay, well, the buyer, go over, I encourage you to buy it from the stores because it's regulated. And as we know, in our small territory, news travel around of cannabis being laced with other killing substance, and we've experienced that as a territory already. So given those factors, and given the current legislation only allows you for various stores to open up when you have a larger marketplace, and it's there already to a large extent, and it still allows for this unregulated cannabis product to get to the buyer. By having more majority accessible cannabis and cleaner cannabis regulated, I would feel comfortable, and most of the leaders would feel comfortable, this is probably the way to go. But I would also think that after the paperwork allows you to do that, doesn't necessarily put you in a position that you have to really screen and approve the applications here anytime after it's legislated and become law. There needs to be a slowly transitional period of education, and that's another factor we heard a lot in our communities. We need to know more. The health implications, for example, of cannabis. So if we have that continuous consultations on those factors as well as many other, how the system is gonna work. If you look at it in my area, we only went to 1 of 5 Sawtooth communities. So that's where the education comes in, and I think that could be incorporated in our transition period prior to the review of applications to become a retail vendor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. I'm just going to briefly say why I'm supporting this. What has happened is when we're in one of my communities I represent is Fort Liard. If we're going to allow the system that's presently being proposed, people from Fort Liard are not going to buy cannabis from mail order. They got a 2-hour drive to Fort Nelson. They can purchase their product right from there. And we're losing revenue, we're losing things. The other thing is that in my small communities, or the communities that I represent, the smaller ones, they're looking for employment. I listened to an elder talk for a long period of time as an opportunity that this could be something that they could look at. So again, it was, the reason I support this is it is an opportunity to diverse the economy and to look at keeping the money in the community, or in the territories, to be able to do it. So that's why I support this motion. Any other further comments in regards to this motion?
Question.
Question has been, motion's in order. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion has passed. Does the minister concur with this amendment? Minister Sebert?
No, I'm afraid we can't concur, and if I may, I'd like to give our reasons. Thank you. We have some concerns about this proposed legislation. I understand the motivation is a desire to see other private retail options be open sooner to allow greater free enterprise before the liquor stores have too great an advantage. But the primary objective of the cannabis legislation is not economic development. It is to take this trade out of the shadows of organized crime and make it less dangerous with a safer, well-regulated option. So I think we should be very careful not to suggest there's a huge market waiting to be captured with lucrative returns to be had. The prices must be set in a way that can displace the illegal market. Everyone should appreciate that it's going to be a challenging operating environment for legitimate enterprises. Unlike organized crime and other existing dealers, legitimate businesses must pay staff, payroll, income and property taxes, provide training, pay insurance, pay WSCC premiums, get business licenses, comply with zoning requirements, and pay rent and utilities. Also, too, cannabis retailers would also have to compete with legitimate mail order and online options that may turn out to be the preferred retail option for most consumers. All cannabis retailers in the NWT will also have to buy their products through the Liquor Commission, acting as a wholesaler to ensure that there's a safe, well-regulated, and approved supply. To meet our objectives, this has to be a regulated product that is treated differently than other products commonly available through many retail channels. I understand that there's excitement for a new industry in the NWT and throughout Canada that will provide welcome opportunities. The notion, however, that the market will be able to sustain stores on every corner like Starbucks needs to be challenged. We also need to remember that cannabis is not coffee. I do not believe that we should be rushing to support a retail landscape that could see cannabis on every corner. We don't do this with retail for alcohol. Other jurisdictions might allow greater access to alcohol through more retail options, but this is the NWT, and we have listened to the views of communities and residents as we engaged on this issue. The retail model put forward in Bill 6 was supported by the majority of respondents to the GNWT's extensive public engagement, and I understand part of that was online, and the majority of residents, admittedly a thin majority, I understand, expressed a preference for the liquor store model to be used in retail for cannabis. I think this makes sense, at least initially. The bill currently provides for other options. What is being proposed through this motion, however, seems to be a replacement of ministerial discretion to consider important questions about how, when, and where these additional retail options would proceed with mere bureaucratic formality. This is an important concern for us. Ministerial discretion is always subject to review for abuse of discretion. I was looking on the weekend at a very old case called Roncarelli and Duplessis, which is 60 years old and dealt with some of these issues in the era of Maurice Duplessis. But where broad policy issues require careful considerations, ministers in the discretion of their powers must be free to govern based on the best interests of the residents and their conceptions of the public good. This is how the system is supposed to work. Requiring regulations first and then insisting that a minister must follow them unless he can reasonably justify doing otherwise introduces a new and different approach, and with it considerable uncertainty. How much discretion is intended to be left to the minister? Consideration for additional stores should include some consideration, and to list but a few: their location, where the new store is proposed to be established, what they can sell. Should they be able to sell toys, candy, cannabis? Does the community support the addition of new stores? What are the security requirements for the new store? What are the inspection requirements for the new store? What should the hours of operation for the stores be? What should the training requirements for staff be? Undoubtedly, there are many more considerations that should be applied. Now, members might suggest that these should be all addressed in regulations, and once a comprehensive list of regulations are developed, the minister should have no, or at least limited discretion to approve additional stores. We don't believe this is the system the majority of NWT residents want. They do not want to see a cannabis store on every corner. Residents, we believe, want cannabis stores to be well regulated, with opportunity for matters related to health and safety and community support to be fully considered. That is what the bill is proposed. The bill as proposed would allow for. I fear that this motion would also undo the key requirement of having the opportunity for the public interest to be carefully considered with each application for a new store. As Attorney General, I am also concerned that a new and untested approach to eliminating ministerial discretion is being proposed. If the intent is not to limit the ministerial discretion to allow for the public interest to be considered, then why add the provisions suggested? The explicit requirement that unless the minister provides a reasonable justification, when read together with the rest of the provisions, would not preserve the necessary ability of the minister to fully exercise his discretion in the public interest. At least it is far from clear that it would. This language is not used in other jurisdictions that I am aware of, and certainly not anywhere in territorial legislation or in the legislation of other Canadian jurisdictions. It is unnecessary and likely to be confusing. Most importantly, however, I believe that this amendment is aimed at ushering in private cannabis retail as quickly as possible, and this is not something I believe the majority of residents want. So ministerial discretion, of course, is always subject to review if it's arbitrary or unfair. I don't know. So those are our comments and concerns about this legislation, which, in our view, is not necessary, changes very much the manner in which ministers properly exercise their discretion. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Comments to Minister Sebert's response. Mr. Testart.
Okay, thank you. I'm disappointed that we couldn't find the common ground necessary to move forward on this motion, and I hope that my colleague brings it forward when we begin our formal proceedings in the House, so we can open it up to further debate. But I did want to just speak to some of the minister's assumptions around the proposed cannabis legislation, and in particular, this element of the bill itself. I agree 100% that the purpose of this legislation needs to be to disrupt the illegal market, that this is not a cash cow for government. It is not necessarily a cash cow for private sector as well. What it will do, by keeping the price point low and keeping the supply broad, will disrupt otherwise black market sales of cannabis, which, as many members commented today, are rampant in communities regardless of their size, regardless of their economic development. Cannabis is a major public health concern in the Northwest Territories, and the current approach of prohibition is failing. I can't understand why privatized, or why expanding the depth of the cannabis retail system will not secure a public policy objective. If the minister's proposing as many as 7 stores to disrupt the sale of cannabis, and those stores will be based in regional centers far away from the areas where cannabis saturation appears to be highest. When he speaks to his belief that the majority of Northerners do not support a privatized system or the contents of this amendment, I'd like to remind the minister that the GNWT conducted consultations with 7 communities or 9 communities, thank you, Mr. Chair, 9 communities, and further supported by an online survey of several hundred respondents. This committee visited 16 communities, including 6 schools, and spoke directly with young people who are the target of the public health and safety policy objectives of this legislation. I believe quite strongly that the committee has a much broader undertook a much broader consultation and has much clearer direction from members of the public on what their desires are. And private cannabis stores available throughout the Northwest Territories was one of those goals. As my colleague, Mr. Simpson, said, this was one of the most common themes next to public education. And as to the concerns around the minister's authority being fettered, my reading of this, certainly it may not be a common limitation placed on ministerial discretion, but it is directly tied to the licensing requirements that are set out in the prior clause of this motion. And I believe that this is a balanced approach that still allows the minister control over saying no to a prospective vendor if they do not meet the requirements. A reasonable justification would be that a vendor does not meet the requirements. That is a fair use of ministerial discretion. Furthermore, the final clause, which wasn't addressed, speaks to the need to allow more people than just vendors designated under the Liquor Act. So it's clear that it establishes new criteria for cannabis stores and requires the government to develop those criteria. And the criteria will be used to, not to limit, but to put a finer point on ministerial discretion around this section. So I think it doesn't overly burden the minister's powers. That's my perspective on this, and it speaks to very serious public policy objectives. If we can't disrupt the sale of illegal cannabis through this legislation, we might as well not be passing it. And without this section, I fear we won't be able to do that. And finally, it would appear to me that the previously announced 2-year review period for developing private sale regulations speaks to a government that is unprepared for this amendment as the bill comes into force, and unprepared for private cannabis stores. This committee has been urging for privatization and economic opportunities from cannabis since we received the bill, and many members of the Legislative Assembly have been making the same appeals to government for some time. That the government is unprepared for this notion is alarming to me, as it has not been a secret. I don't want to belabor this further, but I fully expect this to come back on the floor of the House in our Committee of the Whole proceedings for Bill 6, and I hope it passes then. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you for the chance to respond. I think the minister was attacking a straw man for a bit of his argument there, saying that we're suggesting there's going to be cannabis stores on every corner, like it's coffee, like it's Starbucks or something. First of all, it's the Northwest Territories. There's no any kind of store on every corner. But you know what? I can take you to a bunch of corners that are selling cannabis right now. And so to say that there's no market and people aren't going to go into private business, I think is a little short-sighted. And just as Mr. Testar said, the people who the government polled, or when they went around, were 7 regional centers and 2 smaller communities. And I think we went to 16, or we went to a lot. You know, we went around and we heard from a lot of people. And so I think that maybe the department has a skewed idea of the support that this this amendment has. And the minister also mentioned about the fact that this amendment would direct the minister to do something. He said that the idea that the ministers make decisions pursuant to the act is a new approach that would introduce incredible uncertainty. Well, that's actually the foundation of the rule of law, that we're supposed to follow the law. You know, what the government does is based on these acts. And then the minister listed off a list of regulations that need to be considered. Well, why haven't we considered those regulations? Why don't we have those regulations? I mean, as Mr. Testard said, people have been asking for this. The YK Chamber, the NWT Chamber came here and said, make these regulations, we'll open up stores. And so I'm just not, I don't see the reason for the opposition other than it's just easier to sell through the liquor stores. And I'll just finally point out that the framework, or the task force on cannabis legalization and regulation, you know, this was commissioned by the federal government. They said that basically at all costs, avoid selling cannabis and liquor side by side. And yet that's exactly what we're going to do, which is, it just, on the face of it, it seems like a mistake, considering the problems we have with alcohol in this territory. Someone's going to go into a liquor, and we heard this in the communities, you're going to send someone into a liquor store who maybe wants to buy cannabis, and maybe they transition to cannabis from alcohol, which by all accounts is a much more dangerous drug. And so now you're going to put them in a cannabis store with a bottle right next to them. And that's also a very live issue. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered. But I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to first off acknowledge that it's not a universal call for private retail. So I recognize some of the issues that the minister has raised, and that there is a certain ease and ability to immediately implement a system through liquor retail stores. But there were calls for private retail stores on the parts of some individuals from some communities. And right now, you know, the minister talked about how removing the discretion is going to create uncertainty and is a new and different approach and so on. Well, I think we have incredible uncertainty with the current version of Section 5 of the bill, where anyone can apply to be a vendor, but, you know, we don't know who's going to get approved or not until we see the regulations. And there's been some indication that the minister is not prepared to accept any applications from private vendors until a 2-year period. Well, let's see the regulation, and I would challenge my colleagues to come up with a compromise position. If you know, if it's less than 2 years, if there's another way to allow for private retailers through some sort of system, rather than just leave it completely wide open as the current bill does, I challenge you folks to come up with some options and bring them to us. But we don't have that now. So the amendment was an attempt to try to meet the issues and concerns raised by some of my colleagues from some of the folks that we heard during our consultations. But in the absence of a firm proposal, we've got nothing to work with. And I'm sorry, you folks should have seen this coming. With the news reports and so on from the consultations, there may still be an opportunity for compromise. So that's my challenge to you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't repeat all the comments that have already been made, but I will say that I find, as Mr. Simpson said, that the concerns have been overstated. Many of these concerns are going to be concerns wherever the product is sold, whether that's in Yellowknife or Trout Lake. I want to make the point that small business is a huge economic driver and employer in every community, and that there is a regrettable tendency to overregulate so that small business finds it hard to thrive. In the NWT, they have to be extraordinarily tenacious to put up with the government, and its need to regulate every aspect of life. And so I would just say that we should stop doing that, and here's an opportunity to allow the market within the realm of the regulations contemplated to govern itself. As Mr. Simpson said, no store exists on every corner. No, there will not be enough business for a store to exist on every corner. And so I think that we need to give business an opportunity to regulate itself through the marketplace about who exists, who survives, within the regulations that are contemplated here, which are already very considerable. Thank you.
Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second opportunity is I'll speak briefly on this. Not allowing this type of thing would certainly support the continued purchase of cannabis illegally. There would be very little reason for an individual to pay the travel costs in most communities, and especially remote communities where you can only fly in, pay the travel costs, and then purchase your limit, when you could probably buy it a lot cheaper from a drug dealer that exists. And then so if we're serious about addressing that issue, then we should allow the stores in the small communities, so that individuals, for just economically, it would be a lot easier for them just to go down to the cannabis store. And I think that another factor that we haven't talked much about was displacement of alcohol. I mean, I've seen it in my lifetime. I've seen marijuana displace alcohol. Alcohol is legal. It's devastating. It's destroyed many of our communities, destroyed many families, and an opportunity here for a lot of that to be displaced. And this would make it easier as opposed to more difficult. And I think if we concentrate our sales only in these six communities in 7 locations, then we're not going to be doing anything at all to address the issue of the illegal drugs in the community at all, nothing. It would be foolish for somebody to come all the way to a regional center to buy marijuana at that cost. Thank you.
Mr. Bolio. Mr. McNeely.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with what everybody is saying, and what has my colleagues been said about the different portions of the retail system and the consultation as well. We have 33 communities out there, 7 outlets in 6 communities. What about the remaining market customers in the other communities? Is our government going to support those customers, or the black market? So those are questions there. And the minister came up with a list of conditions, or a list of statements on qualifications. That, to me, exactly could be made up in the criteria for approving the applications that will be coming in. And on the other hand, there's really not, and I think we're speculating on a market that we really can't put a dollar figure on. It's really anybody's guess what sales are going to be. And to say that there's going to be a cannabis store on every corner, like the 7-Eleven, it's very untrue. As you know, operating a business in our north is costly. The operating costs in the smaller communities, just as the same as one product, is. I would like to see it. I don't think it's going to happen. So I'm being mindful of that, and I'm being mindful also. Okay, well, it's not a real lucrative business, so I don't really see a lot of business opportunities or economic opportunities for somebody to jump at it and say, okay, well, I'm gonna start ordering some building material to start up a cannabis store. I think the investment just is not going to be there, and the economics. So we're mentioning a gray area to try to use that to say this is gonna be disturbing. But I agree with all what was said, and I support this on the principles that we have mentioned and our consultation findings. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. I'm just gonna, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going by the act here, there's nothing really stopping the minister or the department to designate a person in the communities to be a vendor. It's just, I feel the way the department's trying to set this up is there's a little more guidelines to follow here. Because if you read 5.1, it states that the minister may designate a person to act as a vendor in a particular community for operation of a cannabis store. So, you know, there's nothing really stopping the department from doing that. I think from the way I hear the minister here is they don't want to set people up for failure, and I agree with that. There's really no, we can't foresee the future here, and you know, for cannabis sales in each community, I think we'll know within the first year what the sales are, and you know, if it's going to be profitable for small businesses, I guess, then you know the minister could support that. That's what I'm seeing anyway. And I know there are a couple communities in Beaufort that are looking at possibly opening up a store, but you know, I tend to agree that you know I don't want to see them fail. But then again, you know, I think it should be sort of proposal driven, like, you know, say the land claim group, for example, say they want to do that, like my colleague mentioned, then, you know, if they have a good proposal, you know, I'm sure it'll just work with the department to do that, and, you know, that's the way I'm seeing this, and that's why I won't be agreeing with that. Thanks. With the proposed motion.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. I guess mine, gray area, good luck with trying to curve it right now if we're going with this model. That means 6 communities are going to have the facilities out there. That means if you take 6.33, that means 27 don't have it. So yeah, you're talking about the mail order. Yeah, that's going to be great. However, people that have the money, they're going to mail order it, they're going to be able to sell it. And so the gray market, I honestly don't see this being curbed by what we're proposing here. Again, I find it really interesting, though, is that our government thinks that they're more knowledgeable than the task force that was assigned us by the federal government. They spent a lot of time, quality time, consulting Canada. And all of a sudden, our government said, no, we'll throw that out, throw out the baby, because we're going to go with this proposal. And so I struggle with that. There has been no rationale. I haven't heard anything from the government. The other thing is Aboriginal governments. My riding has 6, or of the 6 communities, 4 of them are designated authorities. And where's the government's role? And it's silent on this matter. Again, that is a huge issue for me, and we're hearing it across Canada, and our MP has come out and said, you know, he supports Aboriginal governments and working with that, and our government hasn't to do that. As a list of qualifications that the government has come up with, guess what? You guys are going to have to develop that for our liquor stores. So you're already developing it. So You know, why aren't we developing this for the general population? As for businesses, people make decisions to put businesses first and foremost. They're gonna do their homework. If it's not feasible, they're not going to do it. But at least we're giving them that options. The other biggest concern I've heard is that if we go to the liquor stores model presently, we're giving them a 2-year advantage. So now businesses that are trying to develop are gonna have to compete against a well-established business. So they're going to know the challenges, they're going to be able to improve their business. And so, again, what we're trying to do, and we've heard very clearly in the communities that we went and heard from, they want that opportunity. And they want to have that opportunity to ask the government to do it. And we're not curbing the minister's approval or anything. They're just asking for that right to apply to the minister. And instead of the government saying, nope, this is what we're doing. And again, it's very much Big Brother. I'll have to say it's very much Big Brother. Here you go, you gotta do it because we said it's the right thing to do. We failed at the liquor. We've heard this huge issue about liquor and how it's been working. So we have an opportunity to do it right. And again, to me, the opportunity to do right is by having the communities have that opportunity to open stores. They don't have to, but giving them that opportunity. Minister Sebert, should you wish to comment on our comments?
Just,
Minister Sebert?
just very briefly, I'd like to thank committee members for their thoughtful discussion on these complex issues and for the work you did out in the field going around to the communities. Only wanting to add that our officials went to 9 communities and 75% of the population, and there were, in addition, over 1,000 online submissions on this issue. And one thing I think we all need to think about, there seems to be an assumption out there that should it be wide open, that it would end up with small retailers. There's no guarantee of that. It may well be the major retailers, because of cost efficiencies, that would be the ones retailing outside the liquor stores should that model come to pass. We also really don't know the size of the market, and I think some of our thinking was initially that this period of exclusive use for by the liquor stores, exclusive sales, would give entrepreneurs an opportunity to examine the size of the market. But I certainly thank you for your thoughtful comments. Thanks.
Sebert? Sorry. To clause 5, Ms. Green?
I would like to thank everyone who made their points for and against this motion, and I suggest that we now go to question.
The member doesn't occur. The amendment will not take effect as a result of committee to clause 5. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you, Minister Sebert. To clause 6 as amended. Well, that's. So, yeah. So we're on clause 6, right?
Yes. Second part of clause.
Second clause of part 5. So that's that motion, right? Yeah. Ms. Green, the motion.
Is this the separation of
Yes,
stores?
yes.
Okay. The motion is that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following after subsection 5, bracket 6. 6.1. Every agreement referred to in subsection 6 shall require that where a cannabis store is to be located in the same building as a liquor store, the two stores are to be separated so that A, each store has a separate exterior entrance for members of the public, and B, the portion of each store that is open to the public is not accessible from the portion of the other store that is open to the public. That's the motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green, a seconder. Mr. McNeely, can you second it? Okay, thank you. Any comments in regards to this? Ms. Green?
Mr. Chair, the federal government struck a task force to look at the legalization of cannabis prior to introducing its bill a year ago. And the question of co-location and co-use was addressed in that report, and I'm just going to read a small section of it. And I quote, "The potential for increasing rates of use and co-use run counter to the public health of objectives of harm reduction and prevention. In addition, co-location of sales might signify to some that co-use of cannabis and alcohol or tobacco is condoned or encouraged. We heard repeatedly about the significant risks of co-use to public health and safety, especially with respect to driving, and that governments must do whatever they can to prevent it. While there is little research to confirm there is a direct correlation between co-location and co-use, a precautionary approach combined with the example of how other governments have dealt with this issue supports reducing possible risks by banning co-location of sales whenever possible." That's from the Cannabis Task Force and also called the McClellan report. So this motion follows from the recommendation in that report, which says that co-location should not happen. And that is, and for the reasons given that there is concern that co-location will increase co-use of the substances with negative effects all around. That's the rationale for this motion. Thank you.
Ms. Green, any further comments? Mr. Riley?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to be really clear to my cabinet colleagues here. In no community and in talking to any individuals did I ever hear any support for co-location. So if you felt that there was some room for compromise on the last one, yes. This one, I'm not prepared to compromise. This is, we didn't hear any arguments in favor of co-location. I expect, though, that the minister will probably cite renovation costs and the lack of perhaps potential retail spaces in regional centers, smaller communities, and so on, if we ever go down that route. But this is not one I'm prepared to compromise on, and I fully support what my colleague said, the findings of the task force, and this is not one that I'm prepared to move on. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Any further comments? No, seeing none.
Question?
Question has been called. All in favor? Opposed? Minister Sebert, should you wish to have any comments in this? Or do you minister concur to this?
No, we don't concur,
Okay, thank you.
and I do have comments, if I may.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The McClellan report did mention the concerns raised by MLA Green. However, they also said, and I'm quoting from the report, "We acknowledge the challenge of smaller and remote communities that may not have the flexibility to accommodate dedicated separate retail locations, not operations." So apart from the obvious concerns that would be very difficult for the retailers that we're contemplating being able to change their stores in time, there would be, it may be impossible for some of them. The store may not be able to accommodate that sort of a change. They'd have to have, I imagine, additional staff if there was a separate door, if I could put it that way. So that would increase their costs and ultimately increase the cost of the product, perhaps, which would defeat one of the main intentions of the bill, which is to get organized crime out of this business. Also, too, it would be doubtful whether the current liquor retailers, who I think all of whom are private business people, would be able to make these changes in time for legalization. So we do have very many concerns about this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Again, I am disappointed that we weren't able to find this common ground as well, and I hope that when the bill is reviewed in committee of the whole, in a formal session of the House, we'll be able to move this amendment and have more success with it. Members of the mover already spoke to the huge importance around limiting harm by addictive substances or substances that could prove addictive by limiting their access. And, we heard, and I won't direct quote, but the substance of many people concerned about co-location in the smaller communities was that liquor stores would become a one-stop shop for bootleggers. And I think it's somewhat paradoxical that the government is unprepared to support more cannabis stores and more retail opportunities, again, to broaden the retail system and to improve access to retail cannabis. And yet, in this motion, which their justification is it would impact vendors. So you have, on the one hand, we only want 6 to 7 vendors, and on the other hand, we want to protect those vendors. So I think there's a better way to find common ground that ensures harm reduction by having cannabis-only stores and by ensuring that those stores can operate freely and broadly in the Northwest Territories. And when you have a federal task force, which became the expert in educating governments on these policy decisions, that makes a very strong recommendation. And further, mentioned this two-door model that has been in the media as a way to address the concerns that in smaller communities that couldn't support a standalone store, there would be a way to modify those premises. I think in many of the communities, we're not talking about very small communities, we're talking about the regional centers, and my understanding from discussions since it became clear that this would likely be opposed by government, that there are retail spaces in those communities. So I don't completely understand the rationale here, and I think harm reduction outweighs any potential cost to a vendor who wants to co-locate. The simplest solution is to allow a vendor of alcohol who also becomes a vendor of cannabis to open a cannabis-only store. And that ensures, again, that we minimize the risk of supplying bootleggers, supplying illicit traders of cannabis and alcohol, and limit harm reduction towards people who might be exposed to alcohol, who are seeking recreational cannabis, or exposure to retail cannabis from those who are purchasing alcohol. So I'm again disappointed, and I will be supporting this should it come forward again in formal sitting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Any other comments? Okay. The minister does not occur. The amendment will not take effect as a result. Committee to Clause 5, does committee agree? Okay.
Agreed.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. To Clause 6 as amended. This one, yeah. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that the English version of Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended in that portion of subsection 6.1 preceding paragraph A by striking out, quote, that does not have an existing cannabis store, end quote. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
O'Reilly, seconder. Mr. Simpson. To the motion. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to Clause 6 as amended. Does committee agree?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 amended by adding the following after Section 6, brackets 1.1. If the minister is required to give notice underneath Section 1, Okay, subsection 1. Respect of the community that does not have an existing cannabis store, that notice must, A, brackets, advise the community of the ability to hold a plebiscite under Part 4 to determine whether voters support a cannabis prohibition or restriction system in the community. And B, specify the procedures and timelines applicable to holding a plebiscite under Part 4. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seconder, Ms. Green. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. Oh, sorry, Ms. Green, you would like to speak to this? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this section is to address the kinds of concerns that Mr. Blake raised, where communities would be proactively notified about the possibility of a cannabis being sold in their communities, and they would have time to organize a plebiscite before that permission was granted. So the idea here is to give communities control over cannabis being sold. Thank you.
Any further comments?
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Where are we here, sorry? Does the minister concur with the amendment? Or to the amendment, sorry.
Yes, we concur.
Thank you. Minister Sebert, to clause 6 is amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Clause 7 to 10, does committee? Clause 11?
Agreed.
Ms. Green?
Mr. Chair, my motion reads that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by renumbering Section 11 as subsection 11 brackets 1 and adding the following after that renumbered subsection. Brackets 2. For greater certainty, subsection 1 does not operate so as to prohibit a person from possessing in the dwelling house in which the person ordinarily resides an amount of cannabis greater than the amount described in the subsection.
Seconder? Mr. Simpson? Any comments? The motion, Ms. Green?
The purpose of this motion is to allow people to possess more than 30 grams in their dwelling house, which is the personal possession limit. 30 grams is the personal possession limit, but a person may have more than that amount in their dwelling house. This is in part to allow for the cultivation of plants, which may produce more than 30 grams of buds. Thank you.
Any other further comments? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I can agree with the motion that's being put forward to help clarify where the possession limits apply. I know that Quebec is looking at legislation that would limit the total amount in a residence to 150 grams, and I think we should be looking at something like that. But I do support this motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly, any further comments? Seeing none,
Question.
the motion is in order to the motion.
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 11 as amended. Does the committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly.
Mr. Chair, I move the following motion that Section 11 of Schedule A to Bill 6 be renumbered as subsection 11(1), and that the following be added after that renumbered section 3. Notwithstanding subsection 1, a person who has attained 19 years of age but has not attained 25 years of age shall not possess one or more classes of cannabis, the total amount of which, as determined in accordance with Schedule 3 of the Cannabis Act Canada, is equivalent to more than 10 grams of dried cannabis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seconder, Ms. Green. Any comments in regards to this motion? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this motion is being moved by myself as an individual member of the committee. Doesn't yet enjoy committee support. We'll see about that. But the purpose of this amendment, we heard that there's very strong medical evidence that cannabis use in individuals before they are 25 years old has the potential to impact and affect brain development. So the purpose of this motion is to restrict the possession limit for individuals between 19 and 25 from 30 grams, which would be the limit, without this motion, down to 10 grams. And so I believe, and this is consistent with the advice and input that we did receive from some individuals in the communities that we visited, and also from the medical community that did make presentations here in Yellowknife, the Registered Nurses Association, and people representing the Canadian Public Health Association. So personally, I think that the age limit should be set lower, or sorry, should be set higher to 21, but I'll make that argument in committee of the whole with my introductory remarks on the bill when we get to that point. But this motion, I think, starts to help address this issue of potential harm from cannabis to young people, and that's the purpose of this amendment. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I support this motion, obviously, for the reasons that Mr. O'Reilly just outlined, and in response to what we heard from the public, not only from professional associations like the nurses, but from parents who are concerned about the youth not being well informed about the risks, or maybe informed and deciding to take them anyway, but in any case to act as a brake on the amount of cannabis that a young person could have in his or her possession at any given time. And I realize that there needs to be more research done in this area, and that as my colleague Mr. Testart has said in the past, there isn't a great deal of research because this substance has been illegal. But I think that we should be proactive in this area until evidence shows otherwise, that the amount of cannabis consumed by a young person is irrelevant. So that is why I'm supporting this. I believe that a two-tier system is a harm reduction approach that responds to the current state of knowledge on the effects of cannabis on young people's development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank members for bringing this forward. I cannot support this motion, but I welcome the debate. I think it's an important one to have. We spoke to young people in high schools across the Northwest Territories, and I always, when I was moderating the discussions, I always made sure to ask the question, do you think 19 or do you think 25, 24, which age is appropriate? And when the question of a higher age was proposed to them, higher than 19, they said it wouldn't matter. People would still go after it. And even when 19 was brought up, they said, won't matter. Young people will still use. So having an unrealistic age for cannabis is not going to address the problem we have with young people abusing the substance. And my fear is that a two-tiered system is again putting an unnecessary restriction on a substance that young people are already freely using. We have a prohibition system in place now that has a 0 gram limit for young people, and it has failed spectacularly. The rates of youth abuse of cannabis in this country are out of control, and we need to educate children and young people on responsible usage of a recreational intoxicant, much like alcohol and much like tobacco. And we've seen a huge downturn in the rates of tobacco usage amongst young people. The attitudes and norms are changing towards cigarette smoking for the most part. And I expect that once we legalize the substance and can talk about it and educate people on it, young people will make a smart and sober choice for their future. And if you look at the economic assumptions as well, the rate of people who are to become chronic users or new users who will chronically or consume the substance on a routine basis is somewhere at 1.2%. It is not an extraordinary amount, and the health information about brain development from the witnesses who spoke to us, it's about chronic consumption of cannabis, not casual consumption of cannabis. So I think this is far-reaching and ultimately will not assist the real priorities of getting cannabis, or the real mechanisms to get cannabis out of the hands of kids, which is public education in our schools, at home, and in our communities. And that is, of course, a decision government will need to make when they bring forward funding to support those functions. But I don't think this is, prohibition doesn't work. I don't think a two-tiered system will work either. So I can't support this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and I'm sympathetic to all the parents and practitioners who talk about the effects of cannabis on people, on brain development up until they're 25, and I'm well aware that the brain is going through a lot of transformations. Basically, it's a dirt road when you're a teenager, it's a super highway when you're 25, and you know, you put something in there and it can mess with it. But it's been proven that prohibition hasn't been working. I mean, I don't know anyone who has wanted to get high and hasn't been able to get high. And so to think that giving someone 10 grams, which is it's a lot of weed, to give them 10 grams, let them have 10 grams in their possession at a time, to think that's going to curb any sort of the amount that someone is smoking, I think is not based in reality. I think this is going to have no practical effect other than infantilizing people aged 19 to 25. I think, like Mr. Testart said, it has to be about education. I know education is out of the scope of this bill, but that's the only way to reduce consumption of cannabis is through education. And so if the government is serious about it, it's not by limiting the amount that those of a certain age, you know, those people 19 to 25 can have. It's about providing education to people, to youth, to people in their 20s, to elders, and that is really the only way that we're going to affect this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I support the motion. I think that every little bit helps for a deterrence. We were told by the people in the health business that the use of marijuana at a developing brain does have many negative impacts. This may go a ways to preventing a chronic smoking. I think the term that some of the nurses used when they were presenting to us here in Yellowknife in the Great Hall, and there's a possibility that this lower tiered system where individuals, where 25-year-old seems to be the sort of like the magic number for when the human brain is fully developed. This does deter, in my opinion, it would deter chronic smoking, so I'd support this motion.
Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with some of my colleagues here. I feel I can't support this motion here due to the fact that it would add on additional already complicated enforcement conditions. Conditions saying that, okay, you're 19 and a half, you only can have this much. It's a product and it's a society. Either you're going to do it or you're not going to do it at all. And in the area of policing and enforcement, I think it just throws on more conditions to an already short staff system we have, and the other reasons my colleagues have mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Any other comments? Mr. Riley.
Chair, if I can close, then I'd appreciate that opportunity. I just want to make it clear, this is not prohibition that's being proposed. This is a lower possession limit for young people. So it's not prohibition, as at least one member tried to talk about. In none of the 8 U.S. states that have legalized cannabis is the consumption age lower than 21 years old. None of them. So we're going into an area that, or maybe going into an area that's kind of uncharted, I believe, in some ways. Look, I fully believe that education is the right way to try to deal with this as well. But this does have, I believe, some deterrence value, as one of my colleagues has said. And I think we should start with this. And if after a couple of years, we find out that 19 to 25-year-olds are not consuming, we can roll it back or something. But, you know, or deal with this after the review. But I do think that this is the proper approach. And I thank my colleagues for their input. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Question?
Thank you, Mr. Riley. The motion is in order. To the motion, question's been called. All those in favor? 4. All opposed? 3. Motion carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We're not in a position to concur or not concur with this, as we weren't certain what the decision would be in front of committee today. I'll have to take it back to cabinet. I think we do have some concerns about it, but I can't concur at this point.
So the minister did not concur. The amendment will not take effect as a result. So going on to clause 12 to 18. Agreed? Clause 19, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following after Section 19, 19.1, bracket 1. In this section, voter means in relation to a community, a person who is on the list of voters prepared under the Local Authorities Elections Act for the most recent community election. Bracket 2, if at least 20% of the voters of a community in which a cannabis store has been in operation for 2 or more years petition the minister to hold a plebiscite, the minister may order that a plebiscite be held to determine whether the voters of that community wish to establish a restricted quantity system as described in paragraph 12(2)(b). Subsection 3, sections 15 to 19 apply with any necessary modifications to a plebiscite ordered under subsection 2.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. I second this motion. In regards to discussions, oh, you can't, sorry. Can't set chair. So, can I have a seconder? Mr. McNeely. Okay, discussion? Mr. Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank my colleague for second, at least for the purpose of discussion, which is normal course for bringing forward motions, and I appreciate the ability to speak to this. What this motion is about is, right now, the way the bill reads, there's a prohibition on a community holding a plebiscite if there's a store in operation. That plebiscite can be for one of 2 purposes, for a restricted quantity system or for a prohibition. What this motion would allow is that if there's a cannabis store in a community and it has operated for 2 years, at least 2 years, and 20% of the people in that community request a plebiscite, then a plebiscite could be held at the minister's discretion for a restricted quantity system. That restricted quantity system could look at changes in possession limits, purchasing of cannabis, transport or bringing cannabis into a community. Community has that authority even before a store comes in. What this does is allow, after a couple of years, if a community has some concerns, some issues, that it gives them the ability to request a plebiscite for a restricted quantity system. I understand that there may be issues and concerns about the investment that a a private entrepreneur may incur. But I believe that the intent of this motion is to try to balance those rights and interests a little bit better. I would also point out that the minister does have the ability to regulate cannabis stores. And that's basically found in sections 5.6 to 5.8 of the Cannabis Products Act, where the minister can enter into an agreement with a vendor that sets out the terms and conditions. So the terms and conditions of an operation of a store can be changed. And the minister also has authority under section 71F, I, and K to regulate the operation of a cannabis store. So what this does is allow, in my view, communities to have a say in the operation of a cannabis store in the future after a couple of years of experience. And I think this is, I don't see this as, I think that this is a better balancing of rights and interests than currently exists in the bill, and allows for communities to initiate a plebiscite process with a store that might be in place. The minister still has discretion as to whether the plebiscite would take place or not, but I think this just does give communities a little more say after a couple of years' experience with a cannabis store. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Riley, any further comments? Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this motion after some discussions we had earlier in clarity, for the simple fact it's going to give more tools and more authority to the communities to govern themselves. And as you know, we have a lot of third-level, small, remote community social problems. So the more tools we give them on the option side, the better I think leadership and elders and youth would feel comfortable. And I'm also being mindful that the legislation of this bill is really that one we're going to set in place for decades and assemblies to come. So I'm also being mindful of that. We're trying to analyze what we're doing we think is right. So we don't have to come back later and amend and say, we should have thought about this and we should have thought about that. At least we can say, okay, to the community, let's just pick one and say, Delaney, you have the plebiscite option. And at the same token, you already know it's here. So you can capture that through your vendor establishment. And at the same token, you have another option to restrict that. So you're going and moving towards your rehabilitation of the community in that substance abuse. And this product has many arguments to say it triggers other more harder substance. So after some clarification, as I mentioned, I support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely. Mr. Tester?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I understand where this motion is coming from, and certainly the plebiscite sections of the bill have attracted a lot of public attention and were a source of much of the inquiries made during our consultations. My concern around this amendment is it's consistent with sections of the Liquor Act that allow a plebiscite to shut down, for lack of a better word, a licensed establishment, but not for a liquor store. So liquor stores aren't subject to the same plebiscite powers as is being proposed here. Already, we have, you know, I've spoken about this before, but the need to establish a retail system in the Northwest Territories to allow access to affordable cannabis products is the only way to disrupt the black market and the illicit trade of cannabis. And my concern is that for people who are taking a risk as entrepreneurs to enter into an unknown market, which the government is now telling us is uncertain and perhaps not profitable, which I think is a huge concern when that message is being public and we have no economic assumptions to base it on. So in addition to that narrative, we would also be putting in a section of the bill which would allow business to be essentially shut down, which only adds more uncertainty. And I don't think a mail order warehouse is going to disrupt the illegal trade. And I think if after 2 years, as the mover mentioned in debate around the previous amendment, we look at this and say this is a power, that would be the appropriate time to bring it forward. But in the infancy of the retail system, I think it best to allow it to develop on its own and then to apply additional restrictions if they're required. And I feel that this amendment would be premature at this time, and I will not be in support of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I can't support this motion because it's confusing. If you have, let's say, one of the liquor store establishments now decide that 20% of the population of, let's say, Hay River, decide that they're going to pass a plebiscite that restricts the purchase of marijuana from that particular store. Does that apply to other communities? So, my first question would be, can a guy from Enterprise go over there and buy an unlimited amount because he's not a resident of Hay River and he didn't get an opportunity to vote for that store? Or can an individual from Hay River drive to a cannabis store that may be set up in Fort Providence and bring in the full amount that they're allowed to have in all the other communities that don't have plebiscites? So until all those are sorted out, I couldn't support this moving forward because I don't know what would happen. I don't know what happens to people that are not residents. I don't know what happens to residents that go to another community to purchase cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Any other comments? Mr. Riley.
Mr. Chair, yeah, if I can close, then I just want to respond to a couple of comments if I could. This is not about shutting down an existing operation, as one of my colleagues seems to think. This is about giving communities the ability, once a store is open, to look at a restricted quantity system. This is not about prohibition, which a community can do at the opening of the initial store. This is not about prohibition. This is about a restricted quantity system. And it just gives, as one of my colleagues said, one more tool for communities in terms of how to deal with cannabis. So we'll see what happens. I appreciate the discussion, though. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All in favor? Those opposed? Motion defeated. Clause 20 to 22. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we already agreed to that, sorry. Did we agree to 19? We have already agreed to 19, correct? Yeah, okay, sorry. Clause 20 to 22. Clause 23, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my motion reads, Section 23 of Schedule A to Bill 6 be deleted.
Mr. Tester. Any comments, questions? Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, the Section 23 deals with a ministerial advisory committee on the cannabis industry and matters related to the operation of the Act. The committee found that this advisory committee lacked enough detail around its mandate and membership to be in any way truly effective, and for that reason, we've suggested that it be deleted at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I won't be supporting this amendment as I believe that there could be a valuable role for the advisory committee. We did hear that from representatives of the health care community. They wanted to make sure, though, that the right people would sit on the advisory committee, and I think part of the problem with the way this bill has been drafted is that membership on the committee is just left completely open, and I think if this was amended properly to make the committee the sort of committee it can and should be, I'd be prepared to support that, but I don't agree with getting rid of the ability to establish an advisory committee completely, as this motion would do. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Any other further comments? Motion is in order. To the motion?
Questions?
Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Okay. Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 23 as amended, does committee agree? Agreed. Okay, thank you. Clause 24 to 28? Agreed. Clause 29, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by deleting Section 29 and substituting the following. 29 point, no person shall grow, cultivate, propagate, or harvest cannabis except in accordance with the Cannabis Act, in brackets, Canada, and any regulations made under this act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely, seconder. Seconded by Mr. Tester. Any comments? To motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion has carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 29 as amended, does committee agree?
Agreed.
Clause 30 to, Mr. O'Reilly.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I have a question with regard to Section 39(1) of Schedule A that I'd like to ask the minister, if I may. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So this clause of the bill allows the minister to appoint inspectors for the purpose of the Cannabis Products Act. We heard during our consultation that there was a lot of confusion around who was actually going to carry out enforcement of this part of the bill, Schedule A, as well as Schedule B, which is about smoking of cannabis. But can the minister provide any clarity as to who he intends to appoint as inspectors? Is it going to be the RCMP? Is it going to be the municipal bylaw? Other peace officers? Who is going to actually enforce this act? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Sebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure, but I understand that will be the inspectors with the Liquor Commission. I don't know if somebody else at the table here can bail me out on this.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sebert. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the minister's correct. It will be the Liquor Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So nobody else is going to be empowered to carry out inspections or enforce this act. And I just have to sort of think about this for a moment, because really this is about establishing the retail system and possession. And I guess if the possession limits exceed 30 grams, then that's probably a criminal matter for the RCMP to deal with. So may I make a suggestion that in our public communications going forward, we need to clarify this aspect, as well as a bunch of others, but this is one that we heard a lot about in communities about who's going to be enforcing this and for what purposes. So that needs to be made much clearer moving forward. I accept what our cabinet colleagues have told us, and it probably does make sense. I'm going to need to think about it a little bit more, but we need to clarify our communications moving forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister Sebert or Minister McLeod?
Suggestion noted, and we'll take that into account.
Mr. McLeod, any further comments? Mr. Riley? Okay, thank you. So back to clause 30 to 41. Agreed. Committee? I got one agree.
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 42, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subsection 42, brackets 3 of Schedule A to Bill number 6 be deleted and the following substituted. Brackets 3, if any inspector is obstructed in the performance of a duty under this section or requires the expertise of another person in order to perform such a duty, the inspector may call to his or her assistance a peace officer or another person whom the inspector considers appropriate, who shall give the inspector all reasonable assistance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
McNeely, do I have a seconder? Can't do it anymore. Mr. O'Reilly, any comments? Seeing none, motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. To committee, clause 42 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you. Clause 43 to 51. Agree. Clause 52, Mr. Simpson.
I move that section 52 of Schedule A to Bill 6 is renumbered as subsection 52-1 and the following is added after that renumbered section. 2, a justice shall not make an order under subsection 1 unless A, the return of cannabis or other property to the person from whom it was seized would result in a contravention of the act, or B, the person that is the owner or that is entitled to possession of the cannabis or other property is not known. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Seconder. Mr. O'Reilly. Comments? Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment is to address an issue with the bill that seemed to give too broad of a power for seizure to the department. And so I believe the government is in support of it, and I believe it strikes the right balance and serves its purpose. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other comments? Seeing no other comments, the motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All in favor? All opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee, to clause 52 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clause 53 to 57? Agreed. Thank you. Clause 58, Mr. This was, because it's going to the floor. No. Okay, doesn't have to, okay. Okay, so, does clause 58 agree? Great, thank you. 59 to 69. Clause 70? Clause 71? No. Clause 71. Mr. O'Reilly.
I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following paragraph 71C, or after paragraph 71C, C, point 1, respecting the growing, cultivation, propagation, and harvesting of cannabis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seconder? Seconder? Mr. Tetzstart. Any comments? See no comments to the motion. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to Clause 71 as amended. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Clause 72, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My motion reads that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended by renumbering Section 72 as Section 73 and adding the following before that renumbered section. Condominium Act. 72. The Condominium Act is amended by adding the following after Section 7. 7.1. In this section, cannabis means cannabis as defined in subsection 1 brackets L of the Cannabis Products Act. Number 2, no person shall cultivate cannabis in a unit unless A, the person is the owner or tenant of the unit, and B, cultivating cannabis in the unit is not prohibited by a bylaw. And number 3, if bylaws that are in effect immediately before the coming into force of this section prohibit or limit the smoking of tobacco and do not expressly refer to the smoking of cannabis, those bylaws are deemed to prohibit or limit the smoking of cannabis in the same manner that the smoking of tobacco is prohibited or limited. Thank you.
Green, seconder. Mr. McNeely, thank you. Any comments? Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, because some condominium associations prohibit smoking in units and on balconies and in common areas, the point of this amendment is to extend the same prohibition to the smoking of cannabis in those same areas. The other portion of this is about cultivation, and it lines up with the cultivation provisions for privately owned properties, other kinds of privately owned properties where the person who owns the unit is allowed to cultivate up to 4 plants in that unit unless he or she is expressly prohibited from doing so by a bylaw of the condominium association. So the effect of this is that the condominium associations in the Northwest Territories will need to consider how they want to regulate cultivation and smoking going forward once this comes into force. Thank you.
Just to clarify, when you talk about 7.1, in this section, cannabis means cannabis as defined in subsection 1, is that L1 of the cannabis?
It's a 1.
1, so it's 1.
1.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Any other comments? Seeing no other comment.
Question.
To the motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to Clause 72 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 73, Mr. Blake.
Thank you. I move that Schedule A to Bill 6 be amended and renumbered subsection 73 brackets 5 by striking out Cannabis Act in proposed section 61 and substituting Cannabis Products Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Blake, seconder. Mr. Simpson, comments? Seeing no comments, the motion is in order. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favor? The motion, are all opposed? Seeing none, the motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. committee to clause 73 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, so, yeah, there's a second part to section 73, and that is Ms. Green,
I thought it was Mr.
or Mr. McNeely, sorry. Mr. McNeely, sorry.
Okay, that'll be the residential, see what I mean? This one? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule A to Bill number 6 be amended by adding the following after renumbered section number 73, Residential Tenancies Act. 74 point, the Residential Tenancies Act is amended by adding the following after section 46. 46.1 point. In this section, cannabis means cannabis as defined in subsection 1, brackets 1 of the Cannabis Products Act. Paragraph 2, brackets, no person shall cultivate cannabis in a rental premises, F sub 2A, brackets, there is a tenancy agreement in effect in respect of those premises at the time this section comes into force, and that does not refer to such cultivation and
It was different on here, actually. Would you be able to read this one instead?
what's that?
It's different there. You need to read this one.
So this is the right one.
Yes, sorry about that. So much change.
So much paper to juggle.
Can't wait for June the 1st, this confusing bill will be over and done with.
So we have to restart from the beginning.
I move that Schedule A to Bill number 6 be amended by adding the following after renumbered section 73, Residential Tenancies Act. 74 point, the Residential Tenancies Act is amended by adding the following after section 46. 46.1 point, in this section, cannabis means cannabis as defined in subsection 1, brackets 1 of the Cannabis Products Act. 2 brackets, no person shall cultivate cannabis in a rental premises, F, sub brackets A. At the time this section comes into force, there is a tenancy agreement in effect that does not refer to such cultivation, and B, the landlord notifies the tenant in writing that such cultivation is prohibited in the rental premises. Number 3, a tenancy agreement entered into before the day on which this section comes into force that prohibits or limits the smoking of tobacco and does not expressly refer to the smoking of cannabis is deemed or prohibit or limit the smoking of cannabis in the same manner that the smoking of tobacco is prohibited or limited. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely, do I have a seconder? Ms. Green? Any comments? Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was meant to address an issue that was brought up, I believe, in our consultations with the minister prior to going on the road with the bill. And the minister stated that the landlords would have the right to choose whether or not they would allow the cultivation of cannabis in apartments, yet the bill was silent on it. So that this is in response to that. Effectively, it says that tenants will have the right to cultivate cannabis unless the lease states they can't, or the landlord notifies them in writing that they can't, and this would be in effect until a new lease would be signed. And so it's prohibitive in nature, yet it gives landlords the right to, since this is coming on midstream into leases, it gives landlords the right to determine how their properties are being used. I know there are some issues that my colleagues might bring up that relate to the cultivation of cannabis in public housing, and there's legitimate health concerns, but there's also legitimate human rights concerns, and perhaps maybe the minister would be able to give us some insight into their discussions with the housing corporation. Is that permissible, Mr. Chair? So then I'd like to ask the minister, has the department been in talks with the housing corporation to determine how they intend on regulating the growing of cannabis in housing units? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson. Minister Sebert.
Yes, I believe there has been consultation with housing, and they're looking at what is done in other jurisdictions in response to the comment by Emily Simpson. I don't think we have a problem with this generally. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. There was a bit of a change in the wording here that has thrown me a bit off, but I think we will be able to concur with this.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So I asked if the minister could give me an update on what housing is considering. I know he said housing is looking at other jurisdictions, but does the minister have any idea what the housing corporation is considering? Because, they have 2,400 homes that they look after, and this is going to have a major impact on the people of the territory. So does the minister have any information for us other than that they're in consultation, or they're looking into it? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Sebert.
I wonder if I might have Mr. Aiken speak to that.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The NWT Housing Corporation is aware of this issue. They indicated just last week that they are still working on what their approach is going to be. As MLA Simpson noted, it's a very large issue with many, many tenants, Northwest Territories, and they indicated they don't have their position fixed yet, but they are consulting with other jurisdictions to see how it's going to be handled elsewhere. Thank you.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and that's one of the issues with this bill is that it's a big, huge bill that involves a lot of government departments, and we just haven't been given enough time with it. I talked about maybe a special sitting, so we have another month to look at it, because we really need every day to get this figured out. So, I'll leave my comments at that, and maybe some other members would like to speak to this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my main concern is with the public housing tenants. Right now, in the number 3 indicates that wherever public housing tenants are allowed to smoke tobacco, they would be allowed to smoke cannabis. I'm assuming from this year. I know that they restrict cigarette smoking for health reasons and of the other tenants, so like in an apartment style or whatnot. The people that are in detached units can govern their own affairs. Most people don't smoke in front of their children, so I'm assuming that most people that are not smoking in front of their children will continue not to smoke in front of their children, so I don't consider this type of clause to be a necessity. Also, with the Residential Tenancy Act, I think we're going into another act. We're trying to regulate another act with cannabis. I think we should leave it up to the local housing authorities. If they feel that it's become an issue and that's an issue with other tenants, and then maybe they can send a letter to people saying that you can't grow cannabis in your house or your apartment. But I don't think we should make it a rule that we have to have the, if it's silent on it, then the housing corporation would have to send out a letter to their tenants. I think it's going to create an issue, maybe a human rights issue, but my main concern is that we have our poorest citizens in public housing. Right, the people with the lowest incomes live in public housing. Otherwise, you rent your own or own your own, and you can do as you like. So the people that can least afford to go and buy cannabis are not, may potentially be not allowed to grow it in their units here. So I see that as a big issue, that once we start delving into the Residential Tenancy Act with this Cannabis Productions Bill or Act, then we're starting to put the housing corporation in a position where they're going to either say, yes, we're going to allow people to cultivate marijuana and it's going to get bad publicity, or they're going to say, no, you're not going to be allowed, and they're going to get bad publicity. So I think that we should be silent on the thing and let the housing authorities in their communities, they know best how the tenants would react to certain things, and leave it up to the housing authorities to decide whether or not they're going to send a letter to individuals saying you cannot cultivate cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bully. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I agree with my colleague, the MLA from Hay River North, about uncertainty around cultivation and smoking in residential units. That was an issue that we had raised with us in all the communities I went to. So I just would like to ask, though, what happens with the housing corporation now with regard to smoking in public housing? Is that permitted or not? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister McLeod.
Just a quick answer to the member's question is I believe public housing tenants are allowed to smoke in their house, but as the member said before, a lot of them choose not to.
Thank you, Minister McLeod. Mr. Riley.
Okay, thanks for that. So, well, the way that this amendment reads, if people are allowed to smoke tobacco, they would be allowed to smoke cannabis in public housing as well. So, and look, if that's the way this is going to be, may not be okay with everybody, but this needs to be clearly communicated again to people, because people don't know this. And once again, I'm going to call on my cabinet colleagues to clarify the public communications around this, because it's not clear to a lot of the folks that we talk to how this is going to be rolled out over time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Riley. Minister Sebert.
Yes, we understand the difficulties with the section. Of course, I think originally it was our motion, and then has had this amendment. So I think we, inelegantly as it may be, and how difficult it is to read, I think we are able to agree with it. So.
I'll be brief, Mr. Chair, thank you. This is an issue that was raised many times on the road, and I'm very pleased that we have this amendment to consider before us today, and it came about from working with government, and it's an opportunity. If we heard that they don't have clarity from Housing Corporation on how they want to proceed around this issue, and now the bill is giving some clarity to the Housing Corporation and to all tenants, and we work together to achieve this. So I think this is exactly why we review bills and exactly why we work together in our review of bills. And while we may disagree, when we can find improvements that we can get behind, this is a perfect example. So notwithstanding what's going on internally at the Housing Corporation, this amendment sets guidelines and clarity to tenants and landlords alike, and I support it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. McNeely.
My question was answered there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any comments? Seeing none, motion is in order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion passed. Does the minister concur?
Yes, we concur.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 73 as amended, does committee agree? Agreed? Thank you. This concludes section A of Bill 6. Does committee agree that consideration of section A is completed? Agreed? Schedule A, yeah. Thank you. Colleagues, as it is now after 1, I'd propose to recess our clause-by-clause review of Bill 6 and resume these proceedings at the rise of the House today, which will be approximately 5 p.m. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you, committee. Thank you, Minister, and your staff, and we'll see you after the rise.